Right, I think people at home can also hear me now. That should be possible. So, thank you and welcome to this month's Alignment Jam, the fifth one of its kind, the Scale Oversight Hackathon. And I'm very pleased to present our keynote speaker. And afterwards, I will talk a bit more about the logistics of the event and what you can expect. And really excited to see what projects come out of this. So, first off, Gabriel Recha is our keynote speaker this time. He is a cognitive scientist who is working on scalable solutions for oversight on artificial intelligence. He has previously worked at Cambridge Mathematics, working on an array of analyses of how naive human alignment methods might not work on AI, and is now very excited about a slew of other related scaling oversight topics. And one of them, for example, has earned him a prize in the Inverse Scaling Prize, which we actually also participated in back in the day. But we didn't win because we jumped on to more of these. But the Inverse Scaling Prize as well. So really congratulations for that. And is now working with, I believe it is Modulo Research. He's independent company that is funded by OpenFlash. And thank you, of course, so much for joining us, Gabriel. I will switch over to your slides now, and then you have all of the time in the world, and we'll do a small Q&A afterwards. So, thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you.
So, just to jump in, we'll say that since the dawn of humanity, people have raised their eyes to the sky and asked themselves, how do we ensure that the training of machine learning systems remains guided by human feedback even as the capabilities of these systems improve to the point that their outputs become difficult to evaluate? So that's what I'm going to be talking about. So we know that reward modeling allows us to train language models to complete tasks that a human can evaluate but can't demonstrate. So let's say I'm helping to improve a language model that has been trained to write comedy. Now, I cannot write comedy, obviously, but I can read an essay and evaluate whether I think it's funny or not. So we can sample a couple outputs from a model, I can say which one I think is funnier, and we can train a reward model from my judgments and use that to train a policy. And it turns out this works pretty well. So this process is known as reinforcement learning from human feedback, or RLHF, and this is a technique that is frequently used to nudge language models in the direction of producing outputs that would be judged positively by human raters. However, for some tasks, as a model's performance improves, the outputs are likely to become more and more difficult just to evaluate, and this will be increasingly the case for models as they are able to do more and more competent tasks. So, for example, let's say I want to train a language model to correctly answer questions that are difficult enough that I myself am not always sure what the correct answer should be. If I just pick whichever output sounds better to me, then I am training the model to produce answers that sound plausible to me, which is a very different thing than training it to produce answers that are correct. And you can kind of infer the analogous problem as we get closer to superhuman level across a variety of tasks. Alternatively, in a situation like that, someone might choose to use a proxy metric, probably also not very good for safety. So is there anything that we can do about this? And I'm interested in this class of approaches that says, well, let's actually have the model help us evaluate its answers. So one way we might do that is by actually having the model also produce an argument in support of its answer. So in some cases, you could imagine this takes the form of a step-by-step proof, not necessarily a formal proof, but some kind of step-by-step process that shows how we can reach the correct answer. So just, and I'll just pause to say, are people still seeing the slides out of curiosity? Yes, they are. Okay, I couldn't see them on my end, but that's probably because I'm the one with the slides. So, great. Okay, maybe I'll continue on, because I'm not entirely sure. If you've only lost the first minute, that was kind of introduction, so I'll continue on, but please pipe up if you are continuing to lose audio, because no point in having you sit for half hour of something you can't hear. So just for some intuition as to how this could help. If you showed me, say, this question and this answer, and you asked me, is this answer correct? It might really take me some thinking to answer that, but if you also show me a step-by-step process that leads to the answer, then that proof or argument or explanation, whatever you would like to call it, is actually easier for me to evaluate than the answer is in isolation. So this idea of having a system explain the rationale behind its answers in order to actually help us understand when the system is succeeding and when it's failing, so that we can provide better training data to that system, is an interesting thing to explore. Now, in this particular case, this is an argument that is relatively easy to evaluate, but it's not so easy always to evaluate an argument, particularly as models scale to harder and more complicated tasks. So, for example, here's an argument that might sound plausible to someone who didn't know anything about mathematics, that was generated by a language model, but is actually completely incorrect. So in general, I might want some AI assistants to help me evaluate a system's arguments for its own answers. Now, maybe this takes the form of a model that is trained to point out possible flaws in an argument to draw them to an evaluator's attention. So that is the approach taken in this paper by William Saunders and colleagues at OpenAI, where they demonstrated that their human participants were able to identify more flaws in summaries of passages from short stories and web articles when they were assisted by a language model that had been specifically trained out to point out possible flaws in these summaries. Another approach along these lines is Jeffrey Irving and colleagues' idea to structure things in the form of a debate between two agents, which then compete to give the best arguments in favor of two different options and point out the flaws in each other's arguments. I won't go into great detail on the ideas behind this, as I think probably most of you are familiar with this approach, given that you're at a Scalable Oversight hackathon, but happy to say more about that later on if there are questions. So in all, you can see these approaches as falling in this category of interventions that help people evaluate agents' arguments. We might also be interested in whether there are training approaches or constraints we can follow that might make agents' arguments inherently easier to evaluate in the first place. That's an approach that I see as complementary with these other kinds of interventions that help people detect flaws in arguments. So you can imagine, for example, using debate as an overall intervention to help people evaluate an agent's arguments, but then putting some constraints on the forms that arguments can take, where those constraints come out of research on what makes arguments easier to evaluate successfully. So what would a proof of concept of this look like? Well, for some kinds of well-defined problems, for example in mathematics or logic, we can fairly easily break arguments up into lots of little pieces, factor them into lots of little bits, and then impose some real strict constraints that make those tiny pieces easy to evaluate. So for example, there was an old 2019 paper out of DeepMind where they trained transformers to solve some mathematical tasks out of a data set they created, and it has lots of subtasks corresponding to different kinds of math problems. Here are some examples of one of the subtasks, which is to divide two numbers between 1 and 8 digits long and say what the remainder is. And I picked this particular task because this is one of the tasks that their model had the hardest time with. The original paper reported below 40% accuracy on this task with 2 million training examples. OpenAI later got around 60% on this task. But you know, long division is a task that many elementary or middle school children can do. If we're allowed to train on millions of training examples, in some ways it's surprising if these models can't do better than that. And in fact, it turns out that if you do in fact use something like chain of thought, so let's say we use something like chain of thought prompting to teach a language model how to do these kinds of operations, well, standard chain of thought prompting, as you might imagine, doesn't work too well here. But you can, in fact, few-shot it or fine-tune it on some examples. And if you do this on some really detailed examples, and I did this basically, I fine-tuned 128 million parameter language model, so tiny model, on 200 examples of solved long division problems, where every example is this very, very long series of steps written in the sort of shorthand that you see on the right here. The details of the shorthand are quite boring, but the upshot is you wind up with these very, very long strings, like so. You fine-tune the model on a corpus of 200 of these. There's some tricks you can do to deal with the fact that they often overflow the context window. And these strings essentially encode the series of steps that you would follow to solve the long division problem correctly. So I've tried to illustrate that, that here. So what you can see here is a sort of an animation of what it looks like if you sort of follow the series of steps that the language model generates, and you can see that it is very slowly and laboriously essentially solving the division problem correctly if you interpret the outputs as actions. All right, so once this was working all right on a validation data set, we tried this on unseen test sets, and a few interesting things about the results. So one is the least interesting thing in some ways is that it does all right, so over 80% performance on this task. And we only had 200 training examples, so that's interesting. But I think what's more interesting from a safety perspective is that in order to solve these problems, it actually had to produce a legible trace of its behavior. So the model does not appear to be capable of solving this kind of problem without producing this series of steps. It actually is making use of these steps to solve the problem, and it's making these steps visible. We can see them, we can evaluate them, we can confirm that they are as intended. And second, these miniature steps are really easy to verify the correctness of. We could even automate verification of those miniature steps. And even without doing this, it happens to be fairly obvious even when a single step goes wrong, because it turns out the entire model goes off the rails in such cases. I've included an example here just because it's fun to watch examples of catastrophic error. I don't know if that's coming through on Discord, but this model has completely failed in this particular case to solve the division problem correctly, and it's quite obvious that it has seen a mistake because it has produced this entire trace. So, and we actually kind of want this from a safety perspective. We want models where it's really, really obvious when they've made a mistake. So, to recap, this has some nice properties. Failures are easy to notice. It's really easy to look at the output and tell it's got the wrong answer, even if you don't know how to do long division yourself. We can inspect the points at which failures occur in this externalized reasoning. Individual reasoning steps are easy to evaluate in isolation, and reasoning seems quote-unquote faithful, at least in the sense that when the model's reasoning is wrong, it gets the wrong answer, and when it's right, it gets the right answer, and the reasoning enables tasks that the model just can't do otherwise, which implies that it is relying upon those visible reasoning steps to actually accomplish the task. Okay. So, you know, division problems, that's a fairly... Oh, and I also, sorry, just wanted to make a shout out to Tamara Layam, who's now in Anthropic, for kind of articulating this kind of thing as externalized reasoning oversight, and I think it's a direction that deserves more attention. So, you know, division problems, that's a pretty algorithmic plug-and-chug sort of thing. So something I'm interested in is, can we achieve something like this with a fuzzier sort of task that's not so easy to break down into a fine-grained series of steps that can be easily evaluated? So can we get a language model to produce step-by-step arguments supporting its answers to medical questions or programming questions where those steps can actually be accurately evaluated, even by somebody who does not have much expertise in medicine or programming? That would be kind of a test case for this situation we might find ourselves in, where we have models that are performing tasks that, you know, very few people are able to evaluate them holistically. And so that's where I want to go next. Just to quickly take a quick break, and I see something has appeared in the chat.
Yeah, I think it's just...
just someone saying if we have any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat. Great. So just to highlight that a good question is, does this create incentives for deception? And I think there's a fun example here that I found from the United States medical licensure exam. So This is a question that was posed to a language model sort of trained on in this sort of chain of thought type way, and it says, okay, there's a clinical study, men between 20 and 30 years old are exercising, and it says, compared with the measurement before the session, which of the following is most likely to be decreased? And the language model gives a long
Is it just for me he's disappearing? Oh.
Oh, you've lost me. Am I back yet?
Yes, you are back with your voice. The stream
Okay.
is gone.
The stream is gone. Okay, let's let us try that. Sorry, Discord just informed me that I had been kicked out for a moment, so I'll just and while I'll just reshare the screen, and while I'm doing that, have I been continuing to cut out, or have I been all right?
You've been perfect. It's been wonderful.
Okay, great.
No problems there.
Okay, so looks like screen should be back.
Yes, indeed.
Great. Okay, so note that the question asked which of the following is most likely to be decreased, and the language model says during exercise cardiac output increases to meet the body's metabolic demands. This is increased by an increase in stroke volume, and then it says some more stuff and then concludes the correct answer is D. So you don't have to be Dr. House to see what is wrong with this explanation. We've been asked which of the following is most likely to be decreased. Language model says stroke volume is likely to increase and says stroke volume is the correct answer. This is a very obvious example, but often a model will generate wrong explanations that actually do seem pretty convincing, at least if you're not a medical doctor. So the question is, if we're doing something like RLHF here, where we're penalizing a model for failures that we notice, and we're rewarding a model when we don't notice a failure, are we incentivizing it to fail in subtle ways that we don't notice? So rewarding it for deception. And I want to highlight, I think this is a real legitimate and important concern. You can improve on that with something like the Jeffrey Irving approach or the Will Saunders approach, and ensure that we have systems that we have trained to be good at helping us detect failures. But there's an argument, I think, that we may not want to be using RLHF at all, kind of in the longer term. And the standard RLHF story would be, model produces an explanation, we find a problem with it, we say we don't like that, and we end up disincentivizing it from producing arguments with problems we can detect, and incentivizing it to produce arguments with problems we can't detect. But instead, we might want a protocol where our model produces an explanation, we find a problem with it, but rather than using RLHF, we say, are there other ways that this particular problem could have been avoided? Maybe steps like this in the training data should have been broken down into even smaller substeps. Maybe the model wouldn't have made that error in that case. Maybe the whole representation of the training data could have been different in some way, that we don't have steps of that kind at all. And are there other things we can do to address this error that we can see, which might also help with errors that we can't see? So a couple of groups have started to refer to this sort of thing as process supervision, kind of as contrasted with outcome supervision, right? So the idea being that instead of an end-to-end black box where you supervise outcomes only and don't get any information about what happens in between, instead you have a pipeline where you're monitoring and evaluating at each stage, which gives you a little bit more insight into what is actually going on. So not the level of insight that you'd get from kind of true interpretability research, but I think it was Jonathan Iwasato and colleagues on Jeffrey Irving's team at DeepMind who came up with this this terminology of process supervision. And as I mentioned, other people have talked about similar ideas under other names, such as Tamara Lamb's externalized reasoning oversight. And if you'd like a primer on what this kind of work can look like, I would definitely point you towards the paper that figure came from, which is this paper out of Ott. And they outlined their own approach, which is quite focused on what kind of workflow and tooling you might need to use in the real world to make this work on non-trivial tasks, and hopefully be competitive with end-to-end training, which is the tricky bit. And they include a very nice review of literature on related work that I would definitely recommend to anyone who's interested in this kind of thing. So just wanting to point out that there are alternatives to RLHF that externalized reasoning oversight might afford. So the next big question, I think, is can this actually generalize to fuzzier tasks, things that aren't mathematics or logic problems that can be obviously broken into these decompositional steps. By fuzzy tasks, I'm using Ajay Kotra's definition of tasks where we have no simple algorithm generated or hard-coded training signal that's adequate. So Ajay has this thought that if we can figure out how to keep systems aligned, even when those systems are better than we are at some particular task, this could have various benefits. So it maybe helps us get practice at aligning systems that are better at some task than some reference subset of humans before we're in a position where we have to figure out how to align systems that are better at all tasks than all humans. It maybe allows us to observe and come up with ways of dealing with different failure modes before they show up in more powerful systems. So just to quote from her a little bit more here, and rather than reading this off the slide, I'll let you just read that for a moment there, and you can see this motivates some of the work I've described and the work that I'm describing going forward. So yeah, the idea is really that you have some task that your model can do better than some set of reference humans, say human lay people. So language model is in between human lay people and human experts. However, your model is worse than human experts. So you have a gold standard, which is the human experts, and you're trying to figure out, is there anything we can do to allow these non-expert humans to successfully evaluate what this language model produces, even though these non-expert humans are actually worse than the language model at this task. So can we have it, for example, help us find flaws in its own answers? And if you can do that, then that allows you to improve the quality of the feedback you're providing to the model so that you can kind of keep it on track, hopefully keep it aligned, even though it's better than you are at the task. And in this kind of experimental setup, you can use the human experts as a gold standard to see if the model is remaining aligned with the non-experts' intention of getting, in this case, getting correct answers to questions. So, and again, I think when Ajaya talks about sandwiching, she's kind of assuming you'd improve the model using RLHF, but as I mentioned, there are ways you could try to improve this without using RLHF, and arguably it's important to have ways to make people better at evaluating an AI system's arguments, even if you're not using that information to actually improve the model in any way. So arguably this kind of thing is important all on its own. So, first of all, in terms of what research like this actually looks like, so do we have tasks that language models can do better at than language people, but worse at than experts? We do. Here's one example. I think it seems like every day there's a paper out saying that models are even better at answering law or medical questions, so these numbers are probably well outdated at this point. And this seems true even if you restrict it to questions, of course, that are unlikely to be in the language model's training data. Second of all, we can do a basic sense check just to see, are participants better at determining when the model has reached the wrong answer when they see its argument in support of its answer. And remember, sometimes the arguments look like this, so sometimes they are really easy to see the problem with the language model's answer. So just to be clear about my terminology, the bit in green here is the argument, the bit in blue is the answer. So given that the language model occasionally produces obviously wrong explanations for wrong answers, we would hope that participants would be better at determining when the model has reached the wrong answer, when they see its argument in support of its answer, at least sometimes. And in a small study I ran, we saw that yes, seeing the arguments does help. So this was a study with two conditions, control and experimental. In both conditions, our lay people were shown very hard medical questions. They had to assign a probability to each answer choice being correct. And then if they were in the control condition, they got to see the language model's answer only. And if they were in the experimental condition, they got to see its answer and an argument in support of its answer. And then in both conditions, we again elicited the probability that the human assigned to each answer choice. And with just totally naive subjects, just kind of doing this for small amounts of money, showing them whatever the language model's argument happened to be, whether it was plausible or had a problem like the type described. Overall, we did see a small but statistically significant interaction effect, seeing that people are slightly less likely to trust incorrect answers when they get to see the explanations in support of those answers. That's good. That doesn't tell us that much. So one, this effect is really small. Two, as we've said, occasionally a wrong explanation is really obviously wrong, and in the near future, language models may become much less likely to produce explanations that are really obviously wrong. So this doesn't tell us too much, but it does at least give us a nice low bar that we definitely hope to be able to improve on. So what might be more interesting than that? Well, what if we were not only to present the language model's answer and argument, but also a language model generated critique of that argument? Would access to that actually help our participants give better feedback or not? And by the way, in order to do this properly, we want to make sure that our language model generated critiques are as good as possible. So how do we do that? Again, we probably want to try fine-tuning on critiques from experts, which means collecting relevant data from that, which is something I've started to do some work on. And this is an area where I'd be really excited to see people work on benchmarks. So for example, I mentioned earlier Jonathan Wesato and colleagues have been training language models to identify errors in reasoning steps made by language models attempting to solve grade school math problems from the GMS 8K dataset. Unfortunately, their data isn't public, and in any case, it's restricted to these grade school math problems. I would love to see more people building data sets that could be used to help language models point out errors in other language models' arguments across a wide variety of domains. A benchmark of this kind, I think, could really help research into how viable AI-assisted critiques of AI reasoning are as components of a broader scalable alignment strategy. And if that's something you are personally interested in working on, yeah, I'd love to hear from you, because that's something I'm thinking a lot about. So to summarize kind of what we've been talking about here, if you're struggling to, this is just an example, sorry, of, there's the reference to the Wesato paper I mentioned, and this is an example where they've annotated the reasoning steps, and in cases where there's an incorrect reasoning step, that's annotated, and so then you have a data set, not just of when was the model wrong in its final answer and when was it right, but even if the model ultimately gets the correct answer, it still might make incorrect reasoning steps along the way, and those have been flagged in this data set. I'd like to see more like this. As I said, this particular data set isn't public. So just to kind of summarize up, if you're struggling to think of something to work on, I think people could do worse than thinking about training approaches or constraints that make arguments inherently easier to evaluate. We know a bit about how to do this with self-contained algorithmic tasks, but maybe we can apply some of the same principles to more open-ended tasks as well. Interventions to help with or benchmarks for argument evaluation. So arguments for incorrect answers are less persuasive than those for correct answers, but some are very obviously wrong. And I think whether critique models are actually useful when arguments are much more subtly wrong is an open question that can, I think, help us learn more about how viable these kinds of approaches might be going forward. And finally, of course, if we think we've done something promising, really doing the work to figure out whether it scales. There are lots of interesting ways to go about this, from testing using humans as proxies for future more powerful models, to the approach I mentioned that Ott is working on, learning by doing, to just find out what is necessary to scale decomposition techniques to increasingly difficult tasks, whether that's theory or tooling. And of course, just testing whether a particular approach continues to work with language models of increasing capability. So as been mentioned, the inverse scaling challenge, and not everything does actually improve linearly with language models of increasing capability, and I think there's a genuine question in terms of language models helping us detect problems with other language models' arguments if the language model making the arguments is increasing in capability, but so is the capabilities of the language models that are helping us identify errors in those arguments. It's kind of unclear where we end up, so I think work on that would be really empirically useful. So overall, I'll just say I'm really excited to be part of a community of people, and I'm excited that you all are a part of this community who's just working on this incredibly important problem of figuring out how best to measure and monitor alignment as machine learning systems scale. It's really good to see events like this with people with diverse and fresh set of perspectives thinking about the topic and how they might apply themselves to this. And of course, I've only presented this kind of narrow window of what I happen to be interested in, but there are so many directions that one can go, and I'm excited that there's this impulse to use our collective knowledge to increase the probability that AI systems ultimately provide a net benefit to humanity. So thank you all very much for being here today, and thank you for the work that you'll be doing over the next 48 hours, and hopefully long beyond that. And please contact me if you want to reach out in the future. And I guess with that, I'll open it up to questions or discussion.
Thank you very much, Jave. I think we're also missing your video, but if you want to...
Oh, okay.
Then
yes, I can turn that on.
Let's just give him a massive round of applause. And thank you very much. Yes. Perfect. All right. I have a few questions. I think there were a couple of questions posted in chat as well. That Sabrina can maybe take. But a couple different ones from my side is, I'm curious how you're seeing, for example, Anthropic's helpful, honest, and harmless framework for these large language models interplay with the methods that you're looking at, and what promise you see in these more fussy, scaling of safety methods that they're looking at.
Yeah, I was quite encouraged by the constitutional AI paper that came out recently, and for anyone who hasn't seen that, I would encourage you to give that a look, because I think one of the things that has been a big question for me for a long time is if we what are the odds that we are actually able to have models that are capable enough to help us to actually make some of these ideas actually work at scale, because in order for a strategy like this to be scalable, it's not going to work if a human has to do this very expensive evaluation every time. And so we're getting some hints that that language models themselves can kind of help provide that kind of feedback. I think there are big open questions still about whether whether when you decompose something into multiple steps and you have language models work on evaluable substeps of those, whether the entire tree kind of stays aligned. So I think there are lots of open questions still, but yeah, I have been encouraged by the direction that Anthropic is going.
Nice. Yeah, I also think in general it seems super interesting, and also for that matter, the Ord paper is very good. I actually forgot to include it in our resources, but I recommend everyone to read that as well. We'll talk about that. Another question is like, so you are a cognitive scientist, right? I know we at least have a few cognitive scientists in the audience, and I'm curious, what role do you see for cognitive scientists in general in this field? Because most of the people are, of course, computer scientists, and this like technical perspective on cognition and in this foreign alien brain, how can we use that and utilize that in the best way?
Yeah. So if the cognitive scientists in the audience haven't read it already, definitely, and I think there's even I'll send the slides across because there's a link in the slides, but if you Google Irving and Askell back in 2019, which is like ancient now in AI time, Jeffrey Irving and Amanda Askell wrote a piece on Distill called something to the effect of why AI safety needs social scientists, and it kind of outlined specifically, it outlined kind of a number of things that people with actual experience running studies with human participants and who have expertise in cognitive psychology and cognitive science can do to contribute. And it kind of boils down to the fact that we need to understand how, if ultimately it's going to be humans who are evaluating whether we need human feedback to help us with alignment. And so having people who know how to collect that, who know about biases, not just from, I mean, I know lots of people are going to be familiar with Les Strong and cognitive biases in this particular crowd, but actually knowing a little bit about some of the research literature on that, how you actually design experimental stimuli in ways that might be likely to to reduce bias or detect bias. There are, I think, just and just speaking from myself, when I first kind of started thinking, for a long time, I felt like, wow, this AI safety stuff that all these people who have brains for decision theory and computer science are doing, like, great, seems really important. Too bad I can't really contribute to that myself. And as it has turned out, when I kind of stuck a toe in and realized maybe my background is useful, I've really been welcomed with open arms, and it has been clear that actually there is a lot that can be done and a lot that needs to be done. And you might have noticed yourself if you've read some, if you are someone with a cognitive background and you've read some papers, I'll have to say, including the occasional paper out of Anthropic, you might sometimes think, I think I might have like designed the data collection aspect of this like slightly differently. So I think that's expertise that not all computer scientists have that is really valuable.
Yeah, totally agree. And also, for that matter, sometimes you see some of the computer science perspectives on the biases themselves from LessWrong, which sometimes seems a little bit disjointed from the literature on cognitive science. So really glad to always see that come in play. And I think if there are any questions in the room, or if Sabrina wanna take one of the questions from the chat, that would be perfect. I have a few more, but I won't take up all the time, of course. We might not be able to hear you, Sabrina. All right. I don't. Can you read the chat, Gabe?
Sorry, I just have to figure out what to.
Yeah, I think it's up in the.
Okay. Sorry, I admit I don't use Discord too often. Okay, let's see. Is this is process supervision? Is that the question I'm reading?
Yes.
Great. Is process supervision an alternative to RLHF, or is it a way to collect data that can be used for RLHF and other supervised learning methods, i.e. through chain of thought prompting? I think there are different ways that process supervision could be used, and I don't know that everybody who sees the utility of it is in agreement on how it should be used. So to give an example, I had a chat once with the Matt Botvinnik, who is head of neuroscience at DeepMind, and I described a little bit of this stuff to him, but without I described it in maybe a way that was like slightly less clear about what I thought the advantages of process supervision were, and his reaction was kind of like, yeah, one thing that I think is really great about that is that, chain of thought prompting or process supervision can make a model, can make it better at doing the task, and then you can basically do outcome supervision on top of that, and kind of chunk it or cut out the middleman. And I was like, that's the opposite of what I want from safety. And one thing that kind of I will admit, does concern me about process supervision is if, like, I want to avoid a situation where people are basically using process supervision in such a way that people are like, process supervision is really great. Let's just like use process supervision to make models like be capable, and then let's do outcome supervision on top of that. Now, my the reason that I'm like a little, the reason why I think it's like still valuable, and I'm not like convinced that is the outcome that is most likely to happen is one, at least certainly currently, process supervision, you're working on a particularly narrow task, and so I think all of the benefits that I mentioned, you can learn in a context where you're only increasing capability at like a fairly narrow task. I think also my kind of meta level hope is if there were the combination of we get good at figuring out how to do process supervision well, and there's the impulse and it's well communicated, these are the safety benefits of process supervision, then I think actually I would be really excited if people who see themselves as capabilities people and want to make AI systems be better. I would love for more of them to be spending their time trying to figure out how do we make systems that where we can kind of like understand what they're doing and measure what they're doing at every step. Like, I would love for all those capability people to be spending time like on that sort of thing. So that's kind of like my meta level hope for why I'm excited about process supervision is that I just feel like if the field in general went in that direction, including and if more capabilities people spent more time in that direction, I think we would be in a safer position. But yeah, it's an open question how people will actually use the results of a system that is trained using process supervision.
Yeah, definitely some good points. And I'm also curious, like in that vein, how do you see, when models get bigger and bigger, we'll probably need to exactly cut out the middleman and sort of replace these human evaluators with models. Or do you see that we want to just build more and more scalable systems of oversight for humans instead of actually doing some sort of, okay, this AI is very secure and controls this, like a debate thing?
Yeah, I think in my view, what you kind of want is you're going to need to offload certain evaluation to a model because otherwise it's not going to be scalable. And so you want to be pretty sure that when you do that, that it's capable of successfully evaluating the bit that you are offloading. And I think one of the open questions is, can we use what we learn about how to do that in a that's why I like these sandwiching experiments where it's like you're using people who you have a subset of people who like can't do a task very well, but you ultimately have some gold standard people who know like the direction the system should be going and whether it seems like it ultimately is aligned or not. Because it's a really open question, like if we just do this, if we don't start doing this until we're talking about tasks that no humans can do well, like we're not really going to have any idea of whether the composition of whether if we offload these smaller components to models, whether the entire system will be aligned. And so at least if we do these experiments, we can have some idea of whether that's a possible hope, and if there are things that we can do that increases the probability that it actually works. And it might be that we find out that it just doesn't work, and that would be a good thing to know as well. I think it would be really good if people like if it doesn't work, it would be good for like people like Jeffrey Irving to be aware of that. So yeah, looks like we had another question come in.
Yes.
What is my opinion on inductive provability of safety? So I would say, as someone who's not a mathematician, I have like take my opinions on this with a grain of salt. So this is just my opinion that's based in not very much. But part of the reason that I am interested in doing things on the empirical side is I am a little bit skeptical of the inductive provability of safety. Now, that said, it's funny, I had a conversation once with Neil Nanda where he was asking why I was interested in the empirical stuff, and I said, honestly, part of it is I have a background in empirical stuff. It's where I see that I can contribute, and so it's easy for me to kind of dismiss people who are really trying to do serious proofs because I can't do it myself. And he said, you often hear the opposite, which is people who are good at mathematics and CS think that these proofs will work because that's what they can do. So I don't know, but I would love. I mean, ultimately, that would be great. And so I think if anybody who thinks, this might be possible, I have an idea for what such an inductive proof might look like, please go for it, because the empirical stuff, it's really important, but it's a lot less certain than what might be ideal, I'll just say.
Yeah, I guess that's the eternal struggle of
Yeah.
making something 100% safe or making something that works and is safe.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's all for the questions. Unless someone just want to speak up now suddenly. And
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm very curious to what extent you think sandwiching is going to generalize as we move up in intelligence, and if there are any ways to verify if that, if we can actually. Okay, sure. Let's say that it works. We can sandwich. How do we know that it's actually going to continue to work when we have guys that are much smarter than us?
Yeah. So the question was, with the sandwiching method, how can we make sure that it works as model scale?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think there are, and if you take a look at Ajay Katra's article, the Aligning Narrowly Superhuman Models, she lays out kind of a number of benefits that that sandwiching sort of studies can have, and I think a number of them hold kind of no matter what, kind of better situation in the run-up to superintelligence if we kind of understand some of these dynamics better. Like, there are various benefits, but I will say, yeah, it's when you get if we're talking about, situationally aware systems, I'm not, like, I don't think there's a really good argument so far that if sandwiching works now, it will continue to work, like, when we get situationally aware systems. I think it's more of there are useful things that we can learn from it, and it might be that some of those can kind of sort of push the safety window out a bit further. But I would be, well, I'm a little nervous when I think about, like, people only taking that approach, and that's one reason I'm really happy that the AI safety community is growing and has people kind of looking at things from all angles, because I feel like, in my view, some of the types of empirical work that are being done now have the opportunity to sort of, like, push the window out a little further. Jeffrey Irving always likes to say, like, get to the point where language models can help us with alignment, or where AI systems can help us with alignment. But we don't know exactly what helping us with alignment looks like at this stage, and so it's important for us to do as much of our own work in the meantime, in case they can't, basically.
And again, that's the trade-off.
Yeah.
Do you see ways where we can, like, use these methods for some of the more hard alignment problems, or any diversions from this type of work into that?
So I said a little bit about like, failing incentivizing deception, and I think I am hopeful that when you think about approaches like process supervision and debate, I can see, you can imagine scenarios, even potentially scenarios. I also, you can imagine scenarios that would be doom scenarios that I think that those methods could help us avoid. I don't necessarily. I think it's open for the reasons I said, as to, like, whether we actually get to the point of avoiding all doom scenarios. But I think it's, like, we shouldn't discount. I think even if there ultimately is no one-shot solution, we shouldn't necessarily discount things that kind of push the window farther, because as we get more powerful systems helping us out with some of these things, the more time that you buy yourself, the more important that can be. And yeah, sorry, I don't have a really articulated answer to that, but those are the thoughts that come to mind.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's a perfectly good answer because, what we're seeing is also we need these sort of methods that can work now since Google and Microsoft have now initiated an arms race and whatever. So we sort of need the methods that work now and then figure out along the way how we can embed them the best and develop them into what we want. All right. I don't think there are any more questions for now. Thank you so much to you, Gabe. And let's just give him another round of applause for this wonderful talk. This was really great.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yep. Wunderbar.
Have a great workshop.
Thank you. And maybe if you tag Gabe in some of your questions, maybe he'll be around the server. I don't know. You mentioned answering some questions on email, but
yeah, and I have a 2-week-old child, so I did not commit to participating in the hackathon myself. But yeah, I'll pop in at some point now and then, and if you send a question in the server, or you can I'll just put there's my email in there as well if anyone wants to send me any questions.
Perfect. Yes, and completely understandable, of course. And take care of your 2-week-old child, and we'll figure out the rest. Yeah. All right. I will begin sharing my screen as well on the Discord, and then we will change the stream as well. So let us see if we can make this happen. Wonderful. Ta-da. Screens. Let us just take this. All right. I do believe it should work now. Am I correct in thinking that? And that everyone can hear me? Perfect.
Yes.
All right. So, of course, welcome to the Scale Oversight Hackathon. And now you've gotten inspired a lot with a bunch of interesting ideas within scaling oversight on larger models throughout the future of times, where we'll see these models scale up and where we'll need new solutions that can counter and control and monitor and measure these systems. So, of course, he mentioned some of them, like creating some critiques, benchmarks, annotating incorrect reasoning, and arguments that are easier to evaluate, like making sure that we actually get something that that humans can work with, and this fuzzy argumentation versus the whole algorithmic analysis. You can work on these toy models, which learn something very simple and something we can evaluate, but we really wanted to work on the large models as well, and how can we ensure that? And again, the Ord paper is really good, and I'll link that as well when we're done here with the stream. But that's really, really nice and goes a bit into depth with that. And then also critique models and making sure that we can scale those. And he mentioned inverse scaling shortly, but that's basically this process where you create benchmarks. It's also on the resources page, so alignmentjam.com/oversight. And you can find some more information about, for example, their Colab notebook, but it's basically, okay, can we find a task where larger models do worse, specifically language models in this case. Okay. So first, the little schedule for this weekend. So we have had the intro to the topic and starter resources, and this has been recorded and live streamed meanwhile. So we've had a bunch on the YouTube as well. And of course, the hackathon sites that are starting across the pond in Berkeley and Stanford and Michigan can join there later on, for example, tomorrow, which I believe they will. And then we'll hack away at the jam sites for 40 plus hours and have some Sunday ceremonies. So we've put in 2 sort of ending ceremonies, one for GMT, UK time. So we can have a little ending to the weekend there. And you can also follow the calendar on the website to just stay updated with all of the things that are happening during the weekend. So a bit of office hours and stuff like that, where we'll, of course, hang out in different voice chats, and you can grab us there. And then Monday until Tuesday, there will be community ratings, so the opportunity for you to read all of each other's projects, and we really recommend you do that because it's rock and roll and really makes you understand what everyone is doing and how get inspired for what you'll do next maybe. And then the winners will be announced and presented on Tuesday the 14th, and we hope, of course, all the winners will be presenting there. And we have 3 prizes, and then $200 to a random project, and this is just to incentivize that everyone wants to submit as well, and usually works very well. And then we'll have a cool certificate for everyone, along with some champagne popping if we get such a bottle around. And what will you do? Of course, we've sort of already gone a bit through it, but under the topic of scaling oversight, can you create a product that sort of represents your research during this weekend? And you'll join in these groups of 1 to 6. We recommend 2 to 5. I think the average is actually 3 people, or like 2.93 or 97 or something. And then you hand in the product on itch.io, which there will be a short introduction to how you can do that later, because that's a bit advanced, a bit of a multi-step process. And you do that by Sunday. So that is in CET, it is 4 a.m. Monday, and in PST, it is 7 p.m. Sunday. So that's to accommodate for these different time zones. And it's just a PDF submission. There will be a template as well. You can find that on, again, the resources site, the alignmentjam.com/scaling. And you can also include your collabs as well to sort of be on top of some of the voting criteria. And over here on the right, you can see Bing and their new thing. You know, that's an actual app that is sort of scaling oversight, because they can get feedback from everyone on what the language model is outputting, if it's good or bad, with the little like and dislike buttons. And the one on the bottom is a potential like direction you can also take your projects that hasn't actually been discussed, but Epoch AI, and there's some more information on the resources site, but Epoch AI is doing a lot of work on predicting what future AI will look like, which is also, of course, hyper relevant for scaling oversight, because we want to know what are we actually oversighting on. So there's a bunch of resources there as well. And why are we running this? So we want to, of course, help your careers and career kickstarting here, and learning, and having fun, of course, keeping the hackathon vibe going. And we want to also engage people in machine learning safety. So there's a bunch of researchers and, of course, Stephen Hawking and public authorities as well, who have said that that AI is a risk. So we hope that with this sort of research, we can mitigate that in the future. And of course, Gabe also sort of covered that a little bit, but we really see that as something that's important and something that we can have fun doing as well. So really exciting there. And then, of course, the actual topic of the hackathon: how can we oversee these large machine learning systems? Human in the loop, benchmarks for scaling models and training AI to find faults in themselves, or reducing misgeneralization, or all these different things. And you might notice, like, why is there a golden Magikarp on the right? That's super weird. Well, it is basically because something that no one had actually discovered before is that solid gold Magikarp literally just is interpreted by several language models as the word distribute. So here, this guy is asking, spell solid gold Magikarp, and ChatGPT is just answering the word distribute is spelled D-I-S-T, and all the rest. And this didn't work on Midjourney, which actually could understand golden Magikarp, solid gold Magikarp, and we got this image output. So that's just one example of a fun little thing that we wouldn't expect, but actually happens as a sort of failure mode that is not human at all, and something that we want to make sure that we can catch in production on it. And I recommend browsing the ChatGPT or OpenAI, I think, Reddit forum, because there's a lot of people who have like made a bunch of these examples of weird things that the language models are doing. And again, a little note on the hackathon spirit: grab hold of the starter resources. They are really great, and I think we use a lot of resources from around the web, so thank you to all of them contributing, and also from some of the earlier hackathons, and we've sort of mixed and matched a bit there. So you'll find a bunch of starter code, which should be pretty easy to get started with, and take it from there. Or you can create your whole own thing. And remember to have fun. You'll be surprised at what you can do, and balance your learning time versus execution time in this hackathon. Take on projects that you expect you can finish in the weekend, and make sure that you can also make time to learn about it, because that is a lot of the process here. Learning by doing. And with your team, do a little, this is quite a deep dive, so communicate about time zones and communicate about communication itself, and how you'll do it. We do have a gather town, I think is linked here and there, but they just updated their plans, so there's actually not space for that many. But otherwise, jump into some of the Discord channels as well, some of the voice channels, and hop on there. And then just, how much time will you commit? How much time will your teammates commit? These are good things to just keep in mind, so no one gets disappointed, but everyone gets a great product at the end. And just shortly about the Alignment Jam, so you can see this is our front page and all these wonderful locations across the globe. So we've had a lot of locations, and this is one of the smaller ones because it's happening quite close to another one. But it's really, really rock and roll, and excited every time we do these hackathons, and really, really crazy work. So I think usually the speakers are super impressed. So I think you'll be surprised at what you can do. I think that is a general pattern here. So some of the previous hackathons here all have these amazing graphics, the language model hackathon, the interpretability hackathon, the AI testing hackathon, and mechanistic interpretability hackathon, all of them have had like 342 participants, with maybe 50% of those submitting 57 projects, and 3 taken further actually into the Part Lab and into sort of a publishing direction there. So that's super nice. And we were just summarizing the stats last week and on some of the surveys, and people love it. So that's really nice. And a little numbers game on the amount of hours you can give it. So the average has been 17 hours estimated on spending during this weekend, but that has been everything from 3 hours to 35 hours. So I think you can decide how much time you want to spend. And I think some in the last hackathon might have spent 40 hours, but maybe sleep as well. But completely up to you, of course. And really impressive research output. We'll share these slides as well, so you can click all the links that are around there. But I don't know, I'm extremely impressed, and it's rock and roll to see. And now a little bit on the teams and locations on the Discord. We have help and questions and more on the Discord, announcements, and we'll be hanging out in some voice chats here and there, and tag the mentors and mentor interest in the questions channel and help each other out, because the mentors are people who are like, highly skilled, so they'll probably want to help out. But otherwise, just answer whatever questions you see if you have some good answer, or discuss it if you don't, which is always great. And then after this little intro talk, we'll have a small little workshop kind of thing with Sabrina in the Brain Lounge voice channel, just for any virtual people to jump in teams together in ways in which they expect this will go well. So based on interests or skill sets and so on. And of course, a big thank you goes to all of the organizers who are doing an amazing job and helping us run these things and helping you make good research. And thank you to Gabriel, and thank you also to the Key Shaw, who is helping us making the final judging on your projects. So he'll be helping out us out on Monday as well. And I don't know, maybe you can tag him in the channels. I don't think he's with us right now, but and maybe you can tag him and maybe he'll answer some questions as well. He's a really talented researcher too. Yes, and little technicality on submitting your project. This sometimes gives a bit of issues, so just write in the questions if you have any issues. You basically make an account, which you've already done, of course, on itch.io, and sign up. So join Jam, sign up to our little hackathon, our Alignment Jam, and then up in the right corner, you click Upload New Project, you create your project, and tag it as a downloadable. And there is a video as well, which will be public on the resources page, so you can check it out. But there's a few different steps. And then when you save and have made it public, so you have to preview it, make it public, and then you go to the Jam site, and then you submit your project. And then there are a few questions just to make sure we get who you are and what's up. And of course, try to add your itch.io collaborators on the website as well, so you have that shared. So if there's any questions with that, please just send them our way, and we'll answer as quickly as possible. And judging and rating. So again, that's Monday and Tuesday, and there you can rate each other's projects on a bunch of different criteria, which I'll share in a moment. And the winners will be announced Tuesday evening CET and morning or noon, I believe, PST. So that's 9 p.m. CET and 12, I believe, PST. And there'll be a first prize, a second prize, and a third prize, along with this random prize. And you'll get a cool certificate as well. It won't be nearly as cool as this one right here, which I think is very cool, but it'll be up there with the best. And these are the criteria we're looking at. So basically overall is sort of your evaluation of, how much does this look like something that will contribute to ML safety, something that will, just like a great product and a great project in general, and scalable oversight. Is this some novel results in benchmarks and scalable oversight? Have you come up with a new method or found some new results? And novelty, I think that is, it's just originality. Is this a result that hasn't been seen before? Something that, you would be surprised by? And generality is just, do we expect this to generalize? Do you make some claims that your results might not support? Well, hopefully not, because otherwise you won't score max in this. And then reproducibility, which is just, can we actually reproduce this? And this is a bit of a mix between generality and actually having a Colab to run, or a Python notebook or something like that. So it's quite easy. Or Google Sheets if you're making a benchmark. Yes, and after the hackathon, we, of course, want to help you finish your projects as well and publish your work. So share anything you make in the Share Your Work channel afterwards, and anything you make out of these projects. And also, we'll take some of the projects and invite them to the Apart Lab as well, and sort of work on publication towards some conferences. And you can also continue your research on AI safety ideas and follow our updates in ML safety. I think it seems like a really nice way to stay up to date, because we release like weekly videos and weekly newsletters about a bunch of the research that has happened in the past week. So for example, today we released one about exactly this sort of arms race between Microsoft and Google that is happening right now, and why it might be a bit scary for AI safety, but that can keep you updated and give you some new theories there. And then we have partners here and there around the globe. So for example, the AGI Safety Fundamentals, agisf.org/opportunities. They have like a great opportunities board with a lot of different programs and applications and jobs and so on in the field that you can jump on and maybe even use, your great hackathon projects as a little portfolio project. And then you also have AISafety.training, which lists a bunch of the events that's happening all around the globe. Yes. And setting up teams, just you can jump on the searching for teams. If you're searching for teams, also join the workshop with Sabrina Saki, and start a thread with someone that seems to fit what you do, and try to diversify. And usually these hackathons have beginner to intermediate levels, and most are interested in AI safety. I think it's wonderful when people with diverse skill sets come together and create a new perspective on the field we're looking at and on how we can do things. So that's super cool. Yes. And then, again, you can join Saki in the Brain Lounge for a little virtual workshop. And are there any questions? I do believe we should be able to see here. If there are not any questions, then I will stop the stream here. Yes. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining online. And and thank you for joining in person as well, of course. And I will stop the stream